At sunrise, the town was peaceful. Farmers worked the fields outside the castle walls. Children carried water through muddy streets, while blacksmiths hammered iron in crowded market squares. Then, the church bells started ringing. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. The warning signal. An army was coming. At first, nobody could see them. Only smoke, dark streaks rising above the distant hills. Then came the sound. Thousands of boots, horse hooves pounding wet earth, war drums echoing through the valley. And finally, banners. Red, black, gold. An enemy lord had arrived. He hadn't come to negotiate. The gates opened immediately. Villagers flooded toward the castle, carrying whatever they could hold. Food, blankets, tools, children. Some dragged carts full of grain, while others carried wounded relatives on their backs. Guards screamed at everyone to move faster, because once the enemy arrived, the gates would close, and anyone left outside would be abandoned. Inside the fortress, panic spread quickly. Archers rushed onto the walls, while barrels of arrows were hauled up narrow stone staircases. Blacksmiths worked without stopping, repairing helmets and sharpening swords. Servants filled every bucket they could find with water, because if flaming arrows hit the castle roofs, the entire fortress could burn. By midday, the enemy army stood outside the walls. Thousands of soldiers covered the fields below the castle. From the towers, defenders watched them build camps across the horizon. Rows of tents appeared one after another, like a second city being born overnight. Then came the order from the castle lord to close the gates. The wooden doors closed slowly. Massive iron chains rattled through the gatehouse, and with one final crash, the castle sealed itself from the outside world. Now the waiting began. Inside the walls were soldiers, servants, blacksmiths, priests, and terrified families. Nobody knew how long the siege would last. Days, weeks, months, maybe longer. Food was counted immediately. Water wells were inspected. Every animal inside the castle suddenly became more valuable than gold, because once supplies ran out, starvation would begin. As night approached, the defenders saw fires spreading across the enemy camp. Hundreds of them, then thousands. The hills glowed orange beneath the dark sky, and from the castle walls, one thing became horrifyingly clear. The enemy wasn't leaving. The siege had only just begun. Night fell slowly over the fortress, and for the first time since the bells had rung that morning, the people inside the castle finally understood the truth. They were trapped, deep beneath the fortress. Servants carried candles through underground storage rooms lined with sacks of grain and salted meat. Officials began counting every piece of food inside the castle, every barrel, every loaf of bread, every animal, and the longer they counted, the quieter the room became. There was food for now, but not forever. Above them, the great hall had become crowded with frightened families. Children slept on piles of straw beside exhausted soldiers still covered in mud from the march back to the castle. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. Even whispers felt dangerous. Every sound echoed through the stone chambers. Crying babies, coughing, the distant hammering of blacksmiths working late into the night. Inside the chapel, villagers packed the wooden benches beneath flickering candlelight. Some prayed silently. Others confessed sins they had hidden for years. A few simply stared at the floor, too afraid to speak at all, because outside those walls, thousands of enemy soldiers waited in the darkness. Near the forge, blacksmiths worked without rest. Sparks exploded into the air as damaged armor was repaired beside stacks of freshly sharpened swords. The room felt unbearably hot. Sweat poured from exhausted workers as the sound of hammering echoed through the fortress like distant thunder. Nobody knew how many weapons would be needed before this siege was over. On the battlements, archers stood watch beneath the cold night wind. Rainwater dripped from their helmets while they stared into the darkness below. At first, the valley seemed silent. Then they saw them, tiny lights moving through the blackness. Torches, hundreds of them. Enemy soldiers were still arriving, far below the walls. The attacking army continued building its camp. New tents appeared every hour. Horses screamed in the darkness. Massive wooden beams were dragged through the mud. And somewhere beyond the hills, war drums began beating again, heavy, relentless. Inside the gatehouse, guards tightened iron chains across the wooden doors. Nobody trusted the gates anymore, not after hearing what siege armies had done to other castles. Burned alive, starved to death, executed after surrender. Every guard inside the fortress had heard the stories, and now they feared becoming one of them. As midnight approached, the castle grew quieter than ever before. No laughter, no music, no conversation, only fear. And somewhere in the darkness outside the walls, a single war horn echoed across the valley. The attack was coming. Before dawn, nobody inside the fortress could sleep anymore. The hallways were filled with movement. Messengers ran between towers carrying orders while servants dragged water barrels across slippery stone floors. Some men tightened armor with shaking hands. Others sat silently, staring into the flames, because in only a few hours, many of them would be dead. Inside the armory, the castle had run out of proper weapons. Kitchen knives were handed to servants. Wood-cutting axes were given to old men. Even boys barely old enough to shave were ordered onto the walls carrying spears taller than themselves. Nobody was safe anymore. In the kitchens, fires burned through the night as cooks prepared the last hot meal many defenders would ever eat. Nobody spoke while they ate. The sound of chewing echoed through the room beneath distant thunder. Some soldiers quietly wrote prayers onto scraps of cloth. Others kissed wooden crosses hanging from their necks. A few simply stared at the doors, waiting for sunrise. Then the dogs began barking. Every guard on the walls froze. From somewhere beyond the darkness came the sound of wood grinding against stone. Loud, heavy, getting closer. The enemy siege tower appeared first. A massive wooden structure rolling slowly through the mud toward the castle walls. Behind it came ladders, hundreds of them. Then the war horn sounded, and suddenly, the entire valley erupted into movement. Torches surged forward through the darkness like rivers of fire. The attack had begun. Bells exploded across the fortress. Archers sprinted onto the battlements. Villagers rushed to carry arrows and stones toward the walls. Priests shouted prayers over the chaos while terrified families hid beneath staircases and tables. Then came the first impact. The battering ram struck the gates with a sound so loud it shook dust from the ceiling beams above. Some defenders covered their ears. Others began crying. And outside the walls, thousands of enemy soldiers screamed together as they charged toward the fortress. For the people trapped inside the castle, dawn had finally arrived.